So my name is Vijay Ganesh. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo in electrical and computer engineering and computer science, as well as the co-director of the Waterloo AI Institute. And I'll be your host today. And this is part of the Waterloo Ethics of Automated Warfare and AI webinar series, which is led by Besma and JF, John Francois, at the CG Institute, which is in Waterloo, along with Kirsty Kearney as well. So with that out of the way, it's my great honor to introduce our speakers today. They are Joanna Bryson and Toby Walsh. So allow me to just give you a little bit of an introduction about their background and accomplishments. So Dr. Toby Walsh is a laureate fellow and Sanchia Professor of Artificial Intelligence in the School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And he also leads the Algorithmic Decision Theory group at Cicero Data 61. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's a legend in AI. His work in constraint programming is very close to my own research in SAT solvers and SFT solvers. I have known his work for many, many years. He's a leading researcher in AI, and the Australian newspaper even dubbed him as a rock star of Australia's digital revolution. He has been elected a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, a fellow of the ACM, the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, and of the European Association for Artificial Intelligence. He has won the prestigious Humboldt Research Award, as well as the NSW Premier's Prize for Excellence in Engineering and ICT, and the ACP Research Excellence Award. He has previously held research positions in England, Scotland, France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Sweden. And he has played a leading role at the UN and elsewhere on the campaign to ban lethal autonomous weapons, aka killer robots. So his bio is very extensive. He has appeared in many different media talking about the impact of AI and robotics on society. So we are truly honored and to have Dr. Toby Walsh at this event. Our next speaker is Dr. Joanna Bryson. She's a professor of ethics and technology from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. She has broad expertise on intelligence, its nature, and its consequences. And she holds 2 degrees each in psychology and AI, a BA from Chicago, an MSc and MPhil from Edinburgh, and PhD from MIT. Dr. Bryson advises governments and corporations and other agencies globally, particularly on AI policy. Her work has appeared in many venues, from Reddit all the way to Journal Science. And from 2002 to 2019, she was computer science faculty at the University of Bath. She has also been affiliated with Harvard Psychology, Oxford Anthropology, and the Mannheim Center for Social Science Research, the Konrad Lorenz Institute for Evolution and Cognition Research, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. And Dr. Bryson has published extensively on AI ethics and appeared in many, her work has appeared in many media out there as well. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Joanna Bryson. With that out of the way, let me get to give a brief introduction about the topic today. And then after that, the way we are going to structure this event is there will be about 10 minutes of opening remarks, first by Toby, followed by Joanna, after which there'll be approximately 20-25 minutes of questions by myself, and I will have some discussion there, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. So the topic for today is AI the solution, or is it already being used? And it is part of our AI ethics and warfare webinar. And the kind of the crux of the question here is whether AI is indeed the solution for stopping wars, or maybe it will exacerbate wars or make things worse, better, not only in the context of warfare, but perhaps society in general. So with that introduction out of the way, I hand it over to Dr. Walsh. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. It's a pleasure to be here. In Australia, we have a really fine tradition of acknowledging the owners of the lands upon which we are meeting. So I'm going to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and extend my respects to the owners of the lands upon which Vijay and everyone else on this call may be on. I'm an optimist. I believe that artificial intelligence offers us great promise to improve how we live and to improve how we live on the world in a more sustainable way. But that's not without its challenges. The world around us, if you look around the room you're sitting in today, is the product largely of human intelligence. And I think it would be conceited to think that we couldn't one day build machines that exceed many of our own capabilities, maybe nearly all of our capabilities, and that would be a potentially better world that we could build. And at the very least, the machines can do the 3Ds, the dirty, the dull, and the dangerous for us, and save us from doing those unpleasant tasks. But equally, I also have strong belief that there should be limits on what exactly we hand over to machines. And the fundamental and basic philosophical reason for why there should be limits is that machines are not accountable. They're not moral beings. They don't have consciousness. I think today it's not clear if they would ever gain that. They perhaps are not the right stuff for that. And the problem then is not artificial intelligence. The smarter the machine, the fewer mistakes, the better it's going to hopefully be at doing whatever task we have given it to do, but it's autonomy. And that's perhaps why some of the most interesting ethical discussion, or some of the most novel ethical discussion, has come around issues to do with autonomy. In autonomous vehicles, we hear lots of debate around trolley problems, and what I want to focus on here around autonomous weapons. We hear a lot of rightfully debate about whether that's going to, as I believe, and I think many other people do, cross a moral red line, take us to a new place, somewhere where we've not had to worry about. I think what's interesting to realize is this is not a black and white issue. There are arguments for and against, and it's therefore worth thinking carefully about those arguments and drawing your own conclusion as to whether the arguments for autonomous weapons outweigh the arguments against. And I strongly believe, as I believe many of my colleagues do, that the arguments strongly against autonomous weapons strongly weigh out against the arguments for. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes quickly going through half a dozen of the arguments for autonomous weapons, and actually try and give you some reasons why those arguments shouldn't hold sway in your mind. The first argument is that autonomous weapons could be more efficient. That may be true in some distant future, but it's certainly not perhaps true today. Certainly what we know from example, the Pentagon papers that were leaked about the use of semi-autonomous drones today is that they're not more efficient. 9 out of 10 of the people being targeted were not the intended targets. And so if you ask me today to hand over killing to a machine, my target would be to make only 9 out of 10 mistakes, and kill 9 out of 10 of the wrong people. But I will concede it's highly likely that machines will one day be more accurate than humans at targeting, and they'll have better sensors, they'll be more laser focused on targeting than we, and they perhaps will make fewer mistakes. And so I'm not sure that that's an argument against autonomous weapons today. I'm not sure it's an argument against autonomous weapons in some distant future. But the second argument is, and I think this is the most interesting of the arguments for, and indeed perhaps the strongest argument that opponents can put up, is that autonomous weapons can be more moral, that machines will follow very precise instructions, and warfare is, of course, a terrible thing, and terrible atrocities get committed in the heat of battle. Humans make mistakes, commit terrible crimes, and that if we hand over the killing to machines, that won't ever happen anymore, that they will follow the very precise instructions. There's unfortunately two fundamental problems with this argument. The first is that we have absolutely no idea how to program international humanitarian law or whatever moral code you decide is the appropriate one for fighting war with. That again is not perhaps a fundamental problem in the long term that I expect if we're going to hand over more and more decisions to more and more important parts of our lives. Eventually, maybe we can crack that one. It's certainly not true of the weapons that are being fielded today and that we're being seen used today. But there's a second, more fundamental problem, challenge, which is that computer systems, all computer systems, can be hacked. And whatever moral codes that we might put in, what moral governance we might try and put in to limit their actions, there are bad people out there who can remove those controls, and we will end up in a very dangerous, terrible world. There are certainly plenty of bad actors out there who won't have any qualms about removing such codes. Third argument is that, well, we could just have machines fight machines. We can get people out of the battlefield. That is a very seductive, very, very attractive idea. But unfortunately, it's naive and misguided. Warfare is not conducted in some separate part of the world called the battlefield, where we can direct the machines to go off and fight. It's fought, sadly, in and amongst towns and cities, in and amongst and against women and children. And we see those terrible scenes happening in Syria and elsewhere. If it was just machines fighting machines, we could decide it by a game of chess or even a game of tiddlywinks. But I somehow don't think the people that we end up in conflict with are going to sign up to those sorts of rules. And so it's misguided to think we could just have the machines fight each other. The fourth argument is that, and this is one that my colleague Stuart Russell puts forward, is that ultimately these will be weapons of mass destruction. And I think there is some truth to that. They will allow us to scale warfare in a way that we've only other previously scaled warfare with other weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons or nuclear weapons, that you can get yourself 1,000 drones. And previously, if you wanted to do harm, you would need 1,000 people to go off in an army to do your work. Now you would just need one programmer. And they do let you scale industrialized warfare in a way that we've only seen with other such weapons of mass destruction. And they have a terrible additional feature, which is that unlike other weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, they will be potentially much more discriminatory. And they won't be as indiscriminate. And that itself is something to be concerned about. And then the observation that we have banned every other weapon of mass destruction, even nuclear weapons. There is now a UN ban, not clear how effective that's going to be, but nevertheless, we have had the courage and conviction to ban to put regulation in the way of every other weapon of mass destruction, to try and prevent its proliferation and its use. And certainly that's the case with chemical weapons and hopefully increasingly with nuclear weapons. And I just quickly go over before I end the final two. One is that autonomous weapons are already here, and sadly that's now actually true. You can certainly see there was a UN report earlier this year about the use of fully autonomous drones in Libya. There are certainly, we see on the Syrian border, such weapons starting to be fielded by the Turkish military. But I don't think that's an argument against trying to regulate autonomous weapons, because every other weapon, with one exception, that we have regulated was already here when we regulated it. Chemical weapons were already here when we regulated them. Biological weapons were already here. The only exception to that was blinding lasers, where we managed to do it before they were actually fielded. But the fact that it's already here doesn't mean you can't ban it. Indeed, we would have no weapons regulation of any other type if we adopted that fatalistic attitude. And then the final argument people put up for us was saying it's all very good and very, very, very fine of you to call for this, Toby, but bans just don't work. And especially something as ephemeral and vague as autonomous weapons is much more difficult. We're going to have lots of autonomy, autonomous cars, lots of AI in our lives. So to think that we could just try and ban it as a technology is unrealistic. I'm not suggesting, and no, I don't think anyone's suggesting we ban AI as a technology. There's plenty of good things that AI is going to bring. It's the development and deployment of AI autonomous weapons that are able to target, identify, track, target humans, especially without much in the way of human oversight. And I think that's realistic to ban, just as it was realistic for us to ban chemical weapons. We didn't ban chemistry, and there's no way that you could ban chemistry, but we did ban people, especially arms companies, developing and deploying chemical weapons. And today, not a single arms company, at least openly, will sell you a chemical weapon. And that's what we could hope for if we were able to regulate autonomous weapons. We could hope that there would be a moral stigma against them. Arms companies would focus on things that didn't put them on UN blacklists, and that would largely limit the spread, proliferation, and use of such weapons. It wouldn't necessarily stop it completely, just like chemical weapons sadly have not been completely stopped. We still occasionally hear stories of them being used, but nevertheless, I think the world is a much safer place because, first of all, we've decided morally as a planet that it's not acceptable to use them, and that there is what safeguards that UN and regulation provides to prevent their use and proliferation. The discussions are going on pretty much as we speak at the United Nations. I'm optimistic. 32 nations or so have called for regulation, and we're starting to see a movement within Europe. The new German government that's hopefully just formed includes the Greens, who have put that on the agenda as something that they wish to push forwards on the international stage. And so I believe it's only a matter of time before we have the good sense to regulate these weapons in some way. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, for those excellent remarks. Joanna, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm not entirely sure where to start. So I basically was saying that I was going to that I think there's a lot of places that I'm in agreement with Professor Walsh. There's a few places that are different, which I'll emphasize, but also a few things to complement. And then I started saying that I am from America, as you might notice from my accent, but I'm actually sitting in Berlin. And I have to say, when Professor Walsh asked us to be thankful for the people who were here before, it's sort of unusual thing to say to people sitting in Germany. And to be fair, I don't think that it's a big moral prerogative to be sitting in the same place as your ancestors anyway. The world is complicated, and war is complicated, and the way that people have moved historically is very, very complicated. Although I love this new respect that's paid, it's not the same as actual redressing of past, economic redressing of to the existing peoples. And and similarly, when I think about is AI a solution, or is it is it something else going to, is it already being used? Well, both of those could be true. So that's a false dichotomy. That that you're setting up something as if if it's already being used, then that's bad. It's not a solution. Maybe there is less warfare now than there has been historically. And again, this is something people argue about a lot. But it does look like generally there's obviously places in which horrific things are happening, but it doesn't seem like we're doing as badly as we had been doing before, at least in Europe. But those innovations, part of them are technological, part of them are political. And so that's another false dichotomy. I don't know if it makes sense to call this a false dichotomy entirely, especially from the position I usually take for ethics. But I had a little trouble with what Professor Walsh was saying in terms of when will the machine do this and when will humans do that? So I'm going to now talk to the authority of Professor Heather Roth, who I just had speaking on exactly these issues. And I just want to give her credit. I totally agree with these things, but I wanted to frame them quite so well. When she thinks about humans in the loop, and where is the human in the loop, and have we got a person, the human in the loop, which is usually set as the alternative to autonomy. she's like, what are you even talking about? There's thousands of humans in the loop. There's so many people that have developed the software, so many people have developed the hardware, the people who have decided which kinds of systems you should advertise to have people build, the people who decide that test the system and say that it's deployable, the people who are out in the field at the time. When you talk about autonomy, it's almost a joke, right? The point is that there's commanders. The commanders have to look, they have missions that have been agreed. Again, there's lawyers, there's all kinds of people decide what are the missions of the day, what's a legitimate target, what are the rules of engagement. And then actually, to some extent, the humanitarian law is one of the weakest, the most flexible things out of all of those considerations. So humanitarian law, the aggressive state can often argue like, oh, but that was proportionate, for whatever my great goal was. So actually the idea that you can separate the man and the machines in this context, it sort of doesn't make sense. We are the set of apes that have an enormous amount of technology with which we magnify our capacity to understand what's happening, to perceive and to act. And the weapon systems, actually, I love working when you really talk to people who are working in the military and that have to deal with these kinds of decisions all the time. They have really interesting forms of moral clarity. So, for example, in America, you are not allowed to deploy something in a theater of war until there's been a signing off, right? And so the system is fully tested, and then the state takes responsibility for the behavior of whatever the equipment is. In any AI, it's still equipment, right? That's the A for artificial intelligence is artifact. So somebody is deployed, trained, or maybe trained. I'm glad that I'm in a context here again with both Vijay and Toby, of people that aren't necessarily thinking it has to be machine learning to be AI. But even if you use machine learning as one of the tools in the toolbox to do your systems design, and it'll never be the sole tool. Even if you use that, all these things still apply. Someone has gone through and tested everything with the mission directives, and otherwise, if it doesn't, they wouldn't be using it. And so then once it is actually used in the field, then the nation who said, I'm going to use this, has taken responsibility for it. So basically any action that happens, there is a defined chain of people who are responsible for it. And when you talk about, full autonomy, like with no person stepping in, we already have had for decades mines, right? Those already are fully autonomous, and we've been working on trying to reduce the number of mines in the world, of course. Again, there's like a couple countries, of which I believe the US is still one, that haven't banned the use of mines, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So I guess as I try to think through the other pieces that I want to get at, I guess the main piece that I haven't already addressed, and like I said, there's a lot of agreement about what the likely futures are, and those 4 points that Toby made, I'm on board with. But one of the things that people do when they project into the future and they say, yeah, but at some point maybe there will be a machine as complicated as a person, or there'll be a machine that takes decisions or is capable of general intelligence as people are. There's nothing more general of intelligence than like what Bayes' law covers, right? The complexity of countries, of running countries. Nobody understands every aspect of a country, right? Nobody understands every aspect of a single human being. So it's not, none of these things are actually the issue. Our ethics are a way by which we cooperate as near peers, and the only way that we can maintain order is by making sure, that our entire system of ethics and justice even makes sense, is by reasoning about other agents similar to us, right? That's how we do things. And so as we go through these systems, it's very important not to reify them into this idea that they are somehow their own entity, and that it might become too complicated for us to understand. And then if that happens, there's some magical point where we should let it go off and be responsible for itself. No, that is the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that the only way that we can keep each other from doing really bad things, and as Professor Walsh was saying, bad people doing bad things, the only way to stop ourselves from doing bad things and the way we deploy our technology and the way we design it is that we have to demand that people create the kind of transparency so that we can audit that the systems are being made correctly, and so that we can be sure of who is responsible. And it's funny because if you talk to like Google or Facebook or Microsoft, at least historically, they're getting better about this, but they used to say, oh, no one could possibly do that. You can't have the good AI. And yet the militaries of the world are showing us that you can do it every day. That's what they do full time. So yeah, AI is already being used. It could potentially be used to do things better. It could potentially be used to do things worse. It's just like the new way that we write stuff down. It's like a new kind of paper. And yes, it can actually, help do some of, fulfill some of the things in overly rigid ways, which can be a problem. And that's one of the things we have to watch out for. But it's not a necessity, and it's not a necessary feature.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. So allow me
I hope
to.
there weren't too many gaps.
Sorry.
Were there any gaps?
No, there was a very minor gap, but it didn't affect the flow at all. Allow me to summarize the points here so that that would inform the discussion going forward. So Professor Walsh, he mentioned that he is an AI optimist. He thinks that AI will better society. At the same time, he wants there to be limits on AI. And his reasoning is that AI, as of now, is not accountable. And this it can be a scary scenario when you think about AI being autonomous. And the arguments in favor of making AI accountable, or perhaps banning autonomous weapons in particular, is that um, uh, they're not moral agents. Um, Machines fighting machines and humans not being impacted by that's a false premise. And we have limited other kinds of weapons of mass destructions successfully in the past. So we should take a page out of that and apply it in this setting. So the question, based on this premise and what Dr. Walsh is saying, is that he would like there be regulation of AI. There is, of course, a question as how do you really implement this regulation, and how do you ensure that AI is indeed accountable? Like if you were to ban it, what about dual use AI? Those questions do arise. So that's the position that Dr. Walsh has taken. Dr. Bryson, her position is, I would characterize that more as an AI realist. AI is already here. It's been here with us. It's going to be here. And whenever we talk about AI, a human is almost always in the loop. So instead of trying to get the AI, get the human. I mean, that's her basic point. So because you could hold the state responsible, you could hold the human who develops, deploys, etc. responsible, and you could have treaties between nations to do that. And she made a very important point about ethics. She said, ethics are the way we cooperate with others, and in particular other agents who are similar to us. So it's a very important point there. And therefore, we don't have to be afraid of AI. It's just similar to us, so we could apply ethics in that scenario as well. All we have to do is demand transparency, audit, responsibility, and don't stigmatize and scare and so on. So those are the two positions. They're not that far apart from each other. Perhaps the methodology with which one would go about making AI accountable might be a bit different. So let me start with, sorry, maybe I mischaracterized something you said. Go ahead.
That was a pretty good summary, but there's one really important point. It's not that artificial intelligence is like us. It's not like us at all. It's an artifact. It's something that we can design. And so when you say, I mean, we could declare an AI system to be a moral or a legal agent. People have actually proposed doing that. But it wouldn't be sustainable because of the fact that it is something that's designed, and so that all of the kinds of ways that we deploy ethics and that we try to deter people from breaking the law, as Professor Walsh said, you could just hack the AI to make it not care about that. I mean, actually, it's hard to hack it to make it care, right? So it's anything that you could put in, like, I don't like to be destroyed, or I don't want to be isolated, you could take back out, okay? So the important point was that we can only exercise justice more or less against peers, and you got that part right. So nations have to do treaties with nations. Maybe if some other organizations are also getting to a supranational level of power, we have to negotiate with them too. But people have to keep other people accountable, and that's what justice is set up for. And technology itself is never accountable. It's a means. We have to trace accountability to humans through the devices we create. So that was what I was asking for, was that we recognize that it's a requirement to make it possible to do that, and to make our systems clear enough, and that the military proves is possible.
Right.
So
Only
I just want to
exception
jump
to
in that.
Go ahead.
I mean, this is the one area where I actually start to disagree with Joanna most, which is that my concerns are not state actors. My concerns are largely non-state actors. And it's idealistic to think, okay, well, yes, the US military is going to apply the very finest standards of developing these systems and deploying them using procedures that people can be very confident that moral atrocities are not going to be committed. But most warfare these days are against other people who have no such standards, and the uses that we already see are such. And so it's the reason to want to regulate autonomous weapons is not because I'm fearful of what the US military is going to do with them. So I'm fearful what ISIL is going to do with them. I'm fearful what terrorists are going to do with them. They will be weapons of terror. And that is why we need to worry about their proliferation. It's the people who don't have the same standards as us.
Right. No, I do. I agree with that point, that we have to have some form of regulation, and I think that Joanna also agrees with that. And I think correct me at any point, Joanna, I think your point is that we already have frameworks for this in place, where we hold people responsible for their actions, and these artificial intelligence artifacts are just another artifact. Use the existing method. You don't need another layer on top. It's kind of the gist of, I guess, what you're saying. Is that fair?
I think I more or less, and but I just want to come back to what Professor Walsh just said.
Right.
It's absolutely true that we have to worry about the fact that, I mean, it's not only about a war. It's about sustainability. It's about
Yeah. For some reason, Joanna's.
Sorry, Vijay. What are you talking over me?
For some reason your video again and audio cut out.
Okay. I'm hearing you guys fine, so I don't know. Okay, all right. So the sorry, now what was I saying? My point is that yes, there is the capacity, and there's definitely in fact, some of the cyber assaults are states that don't have as much efficacy in some domains, and so they choose to go into other domains to sort of basically knock down other people in the world. So yes, we've always had these problems, and I'm not sure that AI massively changes them, although I do think the digital is making things more balanced than it has been in recent history. But I still don't. So I sort of agree with him, but I also sort of think it again, it's not as exceptional as people lay out. We had these concerns before with nuclear weapons too. We have similar problems, and actually with the digital, we have more ways to trace and enforce.
we did have those concerns with nuclear weapons, and we've spent the best part of the last 50 years trying to put better regulation in place and trying to limit the proliferation and of such weapons, and that's an ongoing challenge. And equally, this is going to be a fresh challenge. I'm not sure that these weapons are going to be as attributable as conventional physical weapons. Indeed, that's one of the novel characteristics of autonomous weapons, is that they bring this attribution problem in. There are attacks that have happened on Russian bases in Syria that we don't know who technically was behind them. I mean, we have a very good idea of probably who it is, but you bring down an autonomous weapon, a drone of some sort, and you open it up and it's got Intel chips inside. That doesn't tell you anything. To try and trace back the provenance of those weapons to who set them off is actually a great challenge. And we may end up in conflicts with people where it is that chain of provenance that we're actually trying to work out in terms of who to be responding to. So they are going to be weapons where it's going to be much more difficult to know, and equally in the digital space, in cyber warfare, it is again very challenging. We have very strong evidence that there are various people, actors in North Korea and possibly in Russia, who are behind some of the cyber attacks that we're experiencing. But again, it is very difficult to be sure where those bits came to, where those denial of service attacks were coming to. It is very difficult to work out who was behind them, and that again is another challenge, a somewhat fresher challenge that we have, that we're going to be attacked, and it's going to be much more difficult to work out who's doing the attacking.
I still think that was true in quite a lot of history. that who was paying and who was attacking, that was a problem we've dealt with for a long time.
It was less of a challenge when there were people physically and bodies that you could actually look at and inspect. Say, okay, this person came from here. This person was. It's much more difficult.
I do think you're right about. Well, I mean, if you take down a drone and there's an Intel chip in it, again, it's the information age. It could possibly be that we could tell which Intel chip. And so that is one of the rules that people have actually been making. I used to think it was implausible. So the British, I was one of the authors of the British Principles of Robotics, which included that every single robot, you should be able to tell whose it was. And everybody said, oh no, there's going to be 3D printing. This is going to be impossible. But actually it is a law in quite a lot of countries. And apparently they are usually able to figure out I mean, the origins of these weapon systems, or even the toys that occasionally downplanes for,
I mean, there are a couple of charities I know who do this, who actually open up the drones and look at the provenance of the GPS, look and so on, and it's always the same sort of sale. It was these were sold to some Turkish company who then sold it to some Israeli company. Then the tale goes a bit murky, and then they turn up being used in Syria or somewhere else. Yes,
but at that point,
but that's too late. The harm has been committed.
Yeah, but at that point, you could still say that as far as we trace that chain, we know who sold it to whom, we know who built it, and then you can do the sanctions. This is like what's happening right now, tracing. It's not like we can stop Belarus from doing things with people in their own territory, but we are now sanctioning against the airlines that are facilitating it. So you can trace back in the check, and a lot of this is about the political will to enforce against allies or semi-allies because we don't want to alienate them further. But as soon as you know that this is it's gone through these two places and then it went murky, well, if those people can't say where they sold their weapons, then they absolutely, we should be enforcing accountability on them and assume that they're the ones who caused the problem.
So let me summarize the points that you guys have been discussing. So I think Dr. Walsh, he said AI, the cost of creating an AI weapon is much lower than in the past, right? So practically anybody can do it. Attribution is actually challenging because people can steal the technology, for example. He gave an example of cyber warfare, we just don't know where it's coming from. Also, AI can be dual use, right? So you could be selling AI for a benign purpose, but it can very easily be adapted for very malicious.
That's the same thing with fertilizer. And you try to buy fertilizer in the United States now without really being able to certify and show that. Again, it's not that these aren't problems, it's that they're not extraordinary new problems because of intelligence. The mistakes we make are political, and they don't tend to be as much technological and in fact we have more ways now. Because we have more ways to trace things, we do also have more sophisticated, complicated ways that people are making subterfuge. But I still think this isn't, a lot of times when people blame something on a system itself, when they say, oh, the AI is causing this problem, the AI is doing this, it is not talking about the human socio-technical system that has facilitated some humans getting away with some stuff, right? It's almost never useful to talk about it as if the machine itself is the problem, or the technology, even the technology itself. I know I'm taking it a little bit too extreme. There are definitely, so when you have technologies, for example, the digital, that reduce the cost of distance, then you do make it easier for nations to have impacts inside of each other's borders in ways that we weren't used to. And so that's definitely changing things.
But if I may push back a little bit, and I'm going to push back for both of you a little bit, and maybe I'll start with Joanna. And ask the following question. So when we talk about law, and you know more than I do about law, if you don't have carve outs or reference, not carve outs, but if you don't make very clear reference to the manner in which a particular crime was committed. So you mentioned that there are ways to do attribution. You could go and look at and see which human did it. But if you imagine that you go into a court of law and there was a person who pulled the trigger in a face to face and caused somebody to die, versus somebody who sent in a drone in a territory which is in a different jurisdiction and did something similar, right? So can the law that applies to the setting of pulling the trigger on a gun also equally well apply to essentially pulling the trigger, but now using some kind of AI to do it? Or the AI was autonomous. The person who let the AI command the AI to go and do that was not even aware who got killed. Maybe some collateral damage happened. And can similar laws be applied, or don't you need to somehow update the law to make specific references to AI so that people can then go ahead and apply? Because your argument is the same laws can be assigned to.
This is again one of the specific things that Heather Roth talks about. She says if you think that there's a point where two people come together, and this is what like Rob Sparrow and Peter Sorrow are saying, like real warfare is human dignity, and two people look at each other, acknowledge each other's moral agency, and still murder each other. If that's what you expect from warfare, then you have to go back to some pre-medieval kind of pre-longbow situation. It's just not what happens.
No, my point is simply that law has to make references to the technology, right? Different technologies. So, for example, you cause death due to a weapon that is explicitly designed to do so versus something. I guess my analogy is about the point I'm raising is that somehow the law has to make references to AI technology and has to say, well, this can be dangerous, and there is an explicit reference to it that allows then the legal system to then take action, whether it's through international mechanisms or within nation states. The law has to somehow be updated to have these terms in there that make references to AI technology being used in and maybe autonomous weapons, for example, in an explicit way. And what you're saying is that's not necessary. That's how I understand your position.
I think that the difference here is not a legal one, but actually ultimately a moral one. That we don't want to facilitate war being easier. And indeed, there's this dangerous historical trend. That if you look at military technologies through the last couple of centuries, of distancing ourselves increasingly from the battlefield, of making it a more impersonal somewhat more autonomous activity. And that's not something that I think we need to encourage. Indeed, it's taking warfare to a worse, more dangerous, more terrible place. If we look at the use of semi-autonomous drones today, I think we've been drawn into conflicts there because of this idea that we could fight war without actually declaring war. I mean, it's worth pointing out we fight wars now without we forget to declare them anymore, go through the proper legal niceties of declaring them, and that to pick an example, the President of the United States can sit in the security of the White House and rain terror down on people without paying the moral price of American soldiers sadly dying. And that has drawn us deeper into conflicts that we are never going to answer without literally putting boots on the ground. And indeed has probably, in some ways, exasperated those problems in those places. And here we're talking about taking it perhaps to the next technological step of distancing ourselves, again, in another extreme. And I think there's an interesting point here, which is that the moral harm committed is perhaps not even less, even sometimes greater. It's interesting to look at studies done on drone pilots, that they suffer PSD at a similar, if not greater rate than real combat pilots who are risking their real lives. So that it is no more damaging just because it's done behind a television screen.
I actually, that's really interesting because I was thinking that exact example contradicted part of what you were saying before. So what AI has actually done is pull us all in so that and not just AI, all the digital technology has pulled us in so that we can see more than we had been for about a century of the damage we've been doing ever since air flight. I mean, but as I said, even since the longbow and the cannons, we have been killing people that we were not seeing in the face, so in a way, I hate to say it, but the drone thing, I totally agree with you. Part of the reason I left America was that I didn't want to be involved in battlefields of the future. And part of the reason the Afghan war lasted so much longer than Vietnam was because of the lower number of American casualties. But I mean, the Vietnam War wasn't good on either side. And not that it was good to be carpet bombed if you're in Iraq in the first Gulf War either. And I don't only care about women and children, also conscripted non-volunteer soldiers that are getting carpet bombed are not something I feel morally righteous about either. But yeah.
So perhaps I want to push back a little bit on Toby's point, and Toby's point is that we must regulate autonomous vehicles and that we can regulate autonomous vehicles. So let me buy into the premise that we must regulate autonomous vehicles. Sorry, autonomous weapons. But then how do you really go about doing that? Because a lot of this technology is dual use. It can be used for benign purposes. How do you plan to do that?
That's the easy part. That really is the easy part. I mean, the same argument you could make would say, well, you can't ban chemical weapons because you can't ban chemistry. You can't ban the swimming pool section of the DIY store. So you're not going to be able to limit the availability of the parts of this technology, and you're not going to be able to limit the knowledge of this technology from people being able to take those parts and put them together in bad ways. It's simple. I mean, it's not perfect, and which is that we decide as a world that it's morally unacceptable. We decided that for chemical weapons after we saw the terrible horrors of the First World War, the use of chlorine gas and the like, and we thought that's repugnant, and it is repugnant. And from that, most importantly, it means that arms companies don't develop these weapons and don't deploy them. If you want to use chemical weapons, you have to build them yourself. And terrorists and people that are going to have no qualms about using them don't, fortunately, have research departments that help them do that. They pick up whatever is nearest to them and use that. And so that's what we can hope for with autonomous weapons. It's not going to be perfect. They will be, autonomous weapons will nevertheless still be used. There will be, atrocities committed with the use of autonomous weapons in the future. I'm very sure of that. But they won't proliferate. They won't turn up in the arms bazaars of the world. and they won't be the natural tool for terrorists to use against us.
I think I have a similar but not quite identical answer, which is that you if it's truly dual use, and if there's, then part of what you ban is the application, and you just hold people's accountable to those applications. And yes, sometimes it's hard to tell who it was, but again, we have more and more intelligence. It's getting easier and easier than it's ever been to unfortunately, maybe a little too easy to surveil and track down who's doing what to whom. So I don't. There has been, unfortunately, again, the deployment of unacceptable weapons, for example, in Syria. There's been the bombing of hospitals in Syria by Russia, but the Syrians themselves actually developed their new chemical weapon. We aren't always as good as we'd like to be at enforcing the rules that we've created, and so I agree again that there will be mistakes. And if mistake is the right word, there will be things that aren't stopped as soon as we wish they would have been. But in general, I don't think it's massively different from the situation we're in. And I don't think it's, and to answer your original question, to come back to your original question, I think, again, you're making a false dichotomy, or you're drawing a false line at a point at which that there's something suddenly that because something you can't regulate because it's autonomous. Nothing is that autonomous.
I'm not quite as optimistic as Joanna is about calling people to account. I actually think that there are some bad actors out there who won't care, and therefore we need to make it more difficult for those people to access this technology. And that's in particular not have arms companies be able to sell it. It's not just about holding people account post hoc. It's about taking preventative measures up front, because holding people to account is great for militaries and state actors, but is not great for some of the other players out there.
So that brings me to another question then. I mean, a lot of the points that you raised, Toby, you mentioned accountability or regulation. Joanna mentioned accountability, and perhaps this can be done, say, with non-state actors. But how do you get a state like China to agree to regulations? How do you hold a state like that to account? I mean, there is clearly some kind of a race going on between China and the United States in terms of, we cannot perhaps call it a Cold War, but there is a intense competition between the two over AI development. And what kind of shape do you expect that to take? And what kind of regulation or accountability, if any, that can be implemented in this setting with respect to China?
I want to come back both to this question, but also to the previous question again. All of these points are problems that we've had for a long time, and the AI isn't changing them that much, right? So these kinds of trying to figure out the accountability and making sure you can apply it. But you're right, you're going from, instead of just talking about a drone that anyone can buy, or a shoulder launching rocket which anyone can buy and shoot down a plane, no AI involved, but still this incredible increase with technology of individual autonomy, individual human autonomy. And now if you want to look at the scale of the capacities of America and China, well, it's really quite interesting, because in a way, America at the end of the World War II, had a GDP that was greater than the rest of the world's combined. And I actually, this would be great if you could show Kirsty the slides that I provided. So a lot of people had been telling Europe that we had to side with the US. So this is a meme. This is not very accurate. This is looking just at terms of market capitalization, as if that was the only way. In fact, actually, very large companies we tend to believe that they are not good for security, and that's why we have antitrust laws. But nevertheless, this is trying to show Europe to shut up and help America fight China. You might notice that actually some of the Chinese companies there are Japanese and Korean, and that this figure makes no sense. So we just, and so if you go to the next slide, this slide is looking at two measures of AI capacity. One is the amount of intellectual property that people chose to list with WIPO, and the other is, again, market capitalization, as I said before, kind of a weird measure, since a lot of countries have agreed that market capitalization is too large of companies is a dangerous thing, leads to autocracy. And what you see is actually the world's largest autocrat is also afraid of large market capitalization companies, but has decided to play the game a little bit, but is keeping them right on top of each other. You also see that, Facebook chooses not, and Apple choose not to defend their IP in courts very often. And you see companies like IBM that have been around long enough that they were collaborating with the Nazis that are still stable but don't have giant market capitalization.
Okay, so maybe this is a good time for us to open it up for questions by the attendees. So if there are any questions, comments, please to unmute yourself and raise your hand, and you can do so and ask your question.
Vijay, just one
Yeah.
final
Go ahead, please.
PS to your question. Actually, the country to fear most is probably not China, but Russia, certainly in terms of the discussions going on at the United Nations.
Please, could I have my third slide? I just let me finish what I was going to say. I had one more sentence.
Okay.
I'm sorry if you got cut off. Third
Go
slide.
ahead, please. Yes.
Too, and there's really impressive and generic things. But I totally agree. These metrics don't even touch on Russia or North Korea. Cybersecurity. Iran has fantastic AI capacities. They aren't playing these games, and so demonizing China, although it must be said, China is definitely trying to get military equivalents, but at least it's trying to participate, and it is participating in some of these structures. Okay, I'm done.
Yes, go ahead, Toby, with your point.
Yes, so to pick up that point from Joanna, I think actually probably the part to fear China most is the way China is using AI internally, using against its own citizens, not against us. That is probably the greatest threat to our humanitarian values. And then to bring back to the point, which is certainly, if you look at the UN discussions, it's interesting. When I first started participating in the UN discussions half a dozen years ago, it was China that was the most disruptive and most unhelpful in those discussions. Today, that's changed very significantly. It's Russia that is the bad boy. Everyone is waiting to see how Russia is going to do. And it's just the same not just in discussions around autonomous weapons, around most things. You just look at the meddling that Russia does in general on the world stage. They are maintaining their superpower status by being very disruptive within those, and that's probably where you're going to see the most resistance to regulation.
Go ahead, Joanna. You want to?
I would say that Russia, unfortunately, is not choosing to build up its own capacity, and so it chooses instead to try to destroy others' capacities. And I think that's part of the reason it looks at ways that it can undermine NATO and the EU, but mostly NATO probably was the point. But the assaults on democracies are coming from a lot of places. They're just trying to get relative power.
But I mean, that's again a good example. We know exactly where those assaults came from, and yet the harm has been done. And so we don't have suitable regulation. We don't have suitable controls in place to limit those harms. And I'm fearful wherever the next election happens to be, in whatever country, that Russia will continue to meddle, and there isn't the mechanisms and the rules and accountability to stop them doing that.
So maybe we can broaden this discussion a little bit away from weapon systems. And you mentioned two things, both of you. One was elections, and the other one was the use of AI inside society to control society, right? And within that context, the scale with which you can do that was not possible prior to AI. So you would grant me that much. So therefore, perhaps that would, is a predicate for um, more intensified regulation of AI systems, as well as the attributions that you mentioned, Joanna. So could you comment on that, Joanna, to begin with?
Can I go first again?
Yes, please. Yes. Yes.
So I'm going to make a weird and nuanced point that which the only thing it has in common with what we said before is it's complicated. If you look at the 20th century, there were so many times it wasn't just the two or three you often think about, of mass killings and genocide. When people, Stalin killed more of his own people than Hitler did. Cambodia killed a third of their people. China, enormous numbers of people killed. And sometimes, and not just there, it's like 90 cases of that. It's horrific now that instead, but weirdly compliant with human rights law, that China is rather trying to wipe out the memory of there being ethnic differences and cultural differences, rather than actually trying to exterminate people. It is literally sort of re-educating and wiping out the mosques and wiping out the graveyards and prosecuting and disappearing the academics that they had previously been paying to document the older ways that their Islamic populations had been behaving, because they were actually offended by the extent to which Saudi Arabia was affecting their practices.
Toby?
Well, I think that is a dangerous trend. Orwell got one thing wrong. It's not Big Brother. It's not people watching people. It's computers watching people. And these are technologies that allow you to scale that in an unprecedented way. I mean, East Germany was the limit of what you could do by having humans watching humans. And there are various stories about, some significant fraction of the population, 1/4 or something of the population were watching each other. But that really doesn't scale as nicely or as well as computers. And certainly these are the technologies to allow you to surveil, and if you so choose, suppress a whole nation of people and do it in real time. And that is something.
I've just been talking about East Germany, possibly, because they certainly had like a third of their population on that.
Yeah.
But also, if you look at what ISIS did, they also did complete and perfect surveillance of the places they went into, entirely paper and pencil. Every village they went in, figured out who mattered, and then kidnapped some of the people. And that was part of the way they kept control. So again, this stuff, it is different. It is easier to do, but it might be also easier to change and to disable, I hope. It's not easy. It's not easy.
I can't see how if something's easier to do because you can use technology to help you do what you did with pencil and paper, why that makes it less harmful.
So do you think it's possible that cybersecurity strategies can be used to actually, all the things that people are trying to do in terms of federating data and things like that? Do you think there's ways to actually ensure security? I don't know. In fact, it's one of the things people want to know. Can we really trust AI? Can we really trust Huawei? If we wanted to buy stuff from them, you worked with Alan Bundy. Speaking of being famous,
well, I mean, there are things you could do. I mean, that if you physically disconnect systems, they are no longer able to leak information or be controlled from the outside world. But so the question is, what do you give up by connecting those systems to the real world? I mean, it's interesting to note, warfare has changed. You will know, well, I mean, the irony is, right, so the internet was invented to be a nuclear secure network for when the bomb dropped. And I can assure you, you will know when the bomb drops because the internet will stop. That will be, if you're going to start World War III, the first thing you're going to do is take the internet down.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, so now let's throw a little hope in here. there's, Kant had this idea of perpetual peace, and we had so much interdependencies that it was less probable that you would do that. So we know, I mean, the assaults that people have been doing, constantly checking each other's systems. Can they pull down the energy, the electricity? Can they pull down there's been assaults on the substations that supply all the GAFAM kinds of people. So we know people are thinking about that, but at the same time, there are so many interdependencies. Can we get to the point where actually the level of connectivity is such that it just doesn't make sense to actually execute that? On the other hand, Dan Dennett says that we should all shut down the internet like for one day every 6 months just to make sure we can still function. And people tell him, well, people will die. And he's like, yeah, but that's exactly why we want to make sure that we can handle it. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. So I wanted to kind of segue into more hopeful discussion of AI. So it's not just talking about warfare and regulation, etc. What do you see kind of a hopeful future, maybe starting with Joanna, of AI? And you kind of alluded to it a second ago, like everybody's checking everybody, so maybe they won't do bad things. But I don't know, but please do make your argument.
Well, I mean, the main thing that's hopeful to me is actually that our current challenges, our greatest challenge is sustainability. That there's more people than there's ever been. That although we do bad things, and more people, something like 5 times more people are murdered than killed by war. So as bad as war is, and as bad as murder is, by and large, our biggest problem now is actually it's ecological. And so there will be more war as a consequence of that. But I think we do keep solving these problems, and hopefully we'll solve the next problem too. It's already too late for some people who are dying in floods and conflict and droughts. But hopefully we'll do a good job, and not too many more people will suffer.
Toby?
I think globalization has become a bit of a dirty word, and certainly there have been harms and inequalities that have been exaggerated by globalization. But equally, it is a force for good. I mean, to go back to your question, Mr. How are we going to ensure that China, toes the line? It's because they're economically dependent on us as we are on them, and ultimately we live on the same planet. And our future, our prosperity depends upon theirs, and vice versa. And so that they will have to, we will have to reach some sort of consensus. Because it's in all of our own interest to do so.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree.
Awesome.
So
got both of you to agree on something, and I love that. And I want to go back, we had more of a hopeful view of AI. That was the last point. And I want to go back to this regulation point raised by Toby, because he mentioned that we got to regulate, and we can regulate. We just look at what we did in the past. But I'm wondering what would be the particular challenges, maybe technical, maybe legal, maybe between nations in terms of treaties and so on. What kind of challenges do you foresee which make regulating AI more of a unique thing than other technologies? Is there something that is more unique from your point of view?
Well,
Yeah,
I don't think this is strictly AI. Again, I think it's the digital, but it's the fact that I think we've hit the limit of the hard regulatory problems because we have global assets. So, I mean, China has sort of cut itself off with the Great Firewall, but the fact is that, Google has fiber optic cables that wrap the entire world. Google produces its own chips. So you're talking about something that's sort of like a utility, and nobody is really sure how to govern utilities anyway. And then you have a transnational effort to govern that. So I think actually the digital governance problem is sort of similar to the climate change and sustainability problem. We really have to figure out how to coordinate to regulate this kind of stuff. And having said that, it's not that Google is the big bad guy. They're, Clearview AI, some tiny companies like that are doing more clearly assaults on civil order. But it's just that I think that's what makes it interesting and tricky is the fact that we do have to coordinate transnationally.
Toby?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes we've made over the last 30 or 40 years is to allow companies operate at this transnational scale without applying regulation to them. And there was some belief that somehow um, regulation didn't apply to them because they crossed national borders. Well, that's plainly false. And indeed, I think the welcome development we see now is that nation states and trading blocs like the EU in particular are realizing that they can effectively regulate. Those servers have physical presence. You can still hold people accountable even if it's fiber optic cables that come in from somewhere else. And that's a good thing. And indeed, most of the regulation, effective regulation, is going to happen at that level. It's not going to happen at the level of the G20 or the World Economic Forum or of the United Nations. It's much easier and much more effective to regulate. And what's interesting is to see how viral those regulations are. So as an example, if you're worried about privacy, GDPR was a step in the right direction, not an end, but a step in the direction. Yeah. And interesting to see how that's becoming viral. California has its own equivalent, and many other types of digital regulation. We had a great example here in Australia where there was a huge pushback. Facebook and Google threatened to leave the market completely because they were going to have to pay a small amount of money to support the local media, whose income was being decimated by digital advertising. And they pushed back and threatened to leave. They turned off the news feed for a couple of days. They played very hard ball, not because Australia's a pathetic market, 25 million people. It wasn't worth them worrying themselves about it, but because it was going to set a precedent, and it did set a precedent. And similar, deals have now been enacted by France and various other countries where you're having to pay, where those digital tech giants are having to pay to support local media. And so we are going to see, I think, more effective regulation being put on transnational companies. And it's worth pointing out that is not new. It was the same with the East India Company back in Victorian Britain. There was a company whose fingers spread across the planet and yet was very effectively governed by the Houses of Parliament.
Right. But of course, in that scenario, I think it was in favor of Britain, not particularly in favor of the people that were governed.
Indeed. The wealth that was stolen from the Indian people at the time is a lasting shame upon the United Kingdom. But it's interesting to look back at the historical picture there and realize that there were points where the East India Company overstepped what it should be doing and were sharply called back into place. And of course, it now no longer exists. It proved to be not to be historically long-lasting. So that's a lesson perhaps for the Googles and the Facebooks of the world to realize that you're not too big to be taken down and end up as a footnote of history.
Yeah. So I also urge listeners to type in their questions if you have any questions. If not, we still have about 15 minutes, but Joanna, go ahead. You had a comment there.
Oh, no, I'm just saying I tried to type at one point and couldn't. So I don't know if the typing thing is working or if it's, again, my connectivity.
Yeah, I don't see any questions so far. Maybe are there questions from Jean-Francois or Kirsty or Vesma? All right, so I shall continue.
Ask the question? I tried to ask a question before to Toby, and then unfortunately my internet dropped out. So I don't know if you already answered. But do you think that there's hope with formal methods and cybersecurity of actually sort of tracking down and tracing and locking in who gets to use what data for what? So whenever we enable a state, are we exposing ourselves to someone else possibly being able to come in, or is there a way to pull out the linchpin and have it all collapse if there's an invader or something?
I think we could do a better job using formal methods, but I suspect ultimately it's always a balance between convenience and risk, and we're as humans we tend to incline to convenience, and that will always expose us to the risk that bad actors will do the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can say a couple of things about formal methods because I do come from a formal methods background. And while I should be always promoting formal methods, I actually happen to know too well that it's there are many problems with that technology overall. And one of them is ability to scale with the complexity of the systems that you have to analyze. So there's always that problem with that. So uh, having said that, though, things do keep improving, and hopefully there'll be more adoption of formal methods going forward. Let me maybe change the topic a little bit because you brought cybersecurity, Joanna, um, and and also Toby. And as you know, security of software systems in general is of great concern to governments, to society, to intelligence agencies and defense agencies. But this concern can now be extended to artificial intelligence systems as well. You can attack AI systems using adversarial attacks. You can do data poisoning. You can do membership inference attacks, and so on and so forth. So, what are your general thoughts from that perspective? Because as AI is becoming ubiquitous and people are just adopting it in all kind of settings, the attack surface of these devices and systems is also expanding. Um, so is it, that aspect is a big concern. Trustworthy AI in general is a big concern. And what are your thoughts in general? Maybe Joanna first and then Toby.
Again, I don't like to anthropomorphize AI. Nobody should trust AI. And this is part of the reason, because you aren't talking about a person that you've established a relationship with no longer. No matter how long you've had your system, it could be assaulted. In fact, the older it is, which is what humans tend to trust based on relationship and time spent with someone or whatever, which is completely trivially, easily constructed by a digital system. But anyway, the point is, the older it is, the more likely someone could compromise it. I think we really need to be thinking about what we're connecting onto the internet and how. I think it's terrifying, actually, how much information is readily available. And to be honest, I think that a lot of companies are hiding the amount that they already know or could know. Maybe they're actually trying to flush the amount that they could know. So I think this is, again, one of the areas we really have to come into with regulation. But the government's, like Theresa May's government tried to get many people, not just.
Yeah, so
I'll try to help
Joanna is,
you.
you cut out there for the last about 20 seconds, Joanna.
Oh,
So
sorry. Theresa May's government was trying to break cybersecurity. At the same time, they're trying to get people to trust AI. It was insane.
Toby, your thoughts
Yeah,
on?
a funny story, which was that when I was first invited to go and speak at the first committee of the United Nations about autonomous weapons, I noticed that the next room there was a discussion going around about cyber warfare. So I was completely naive about what they would be talking about. So I sat in the back of the room listening, and I said to my UN host, I said, everything I'm going to say next door about kinetic, physical, lethal autonomous weapons, I should be saying in this room. The concerns are absolutely identical. And you're right, the attack surface is just way larger, way more connected. And all of those issues that we thought about, worried about physical kinetic weapons apply equally well, indeed, in some cases, somewhat more so. I mean, the problem of attribution is one that's probably even more challenging in the cyberspace than it is in the physical space, because you don't have any physical device to look at anymore. You're having to try and trace packets of data, and that's arguably more challenging. So these issues, I think, are only amplified. My host, though, said, don't make it more difficult, Toby. He said it's already difficult to try to get people to to agree on one of them at a time. So we're not going to try and complexify it by putting them two together. But the two are very much together.
What year was that?
That was in 2016.
Yeah, okay, because like 2 years later, the UN were putting them both in the same room. So if that makes you feel better.
Yes, but I mean, unfortunately, if you're disappointed about the progress that's been made on trying to discuss and come up with some consensus around autonomous weapons, you then can make yourself more disappointed by going here the lack of progress around cyber.
Well, no, I've been amazed by the progress I have heard, I was impressed by how the OECD moved forward from 2016 to 2018. I was impressed by what OSCE has been an accomplishment in terms of both these confidence building measures, the fact that they now have ways to communicate, who do you talk to if there's something gone wrong, to check that and also that they realize that's part of their duty to go out and actively help everybody get cyber competent. Otherwise, it's like, just like the pandemic, that if you don't vaccinate everyone, then something can come from anywhere. So actually, I am encouraged by what I hear in these situations. But funny, another story like
on the defense side, but on the offense side, the UN discussion stalled at the barest minimum, which was no first use.
Okay, I haven't paid that much attention to the offense. I'm sorry, but I did want to tell you a story about comparing with again cybersecurity. We were arguing about backdoors at Chatham House, and people were saying, if if there's this weapon in North Korea, wouldn't you want to know that someone had the back door key? And at first I thought, oh, that's very attracting. And then I thought, no, because if one of those weapons gets shot, I want to know who shot it. And as soon as there's a backdoor key, then it could have been anyone. And so this goes back to the attribution thing.
But there's nothing that stops me wanting to take down your water supply, to turn off the power at your hospitals and murder your citizens by using cyber today. And there was no international consensus on that at all, sadly.
I think that's wrong. I was just listening to the German officer in charge of a diplomat in charge of this today at Hertie School by coincidence, and basically all the things that apply to hospitals they have agreed now that all the same rules apply in cyber. So that's one of the few cases that is actually taken care of. But there shouldn't be assaults on healthcare. But at least that's what I heard today from Germany. I don't know.
As we come to the close of the session, I always like to kind of, whenever there's a discussion about AI, ask the speakers to reflect on the far future and how far AI can go. Can AGI be achieved? And if so, AI creating itself, AI improving itself in ways we can't even imagine today. And what do you think in terms of the very long term? What are your thoughts? And when it comes to the regulations today, or methods like security defense mechanisms or formal methods or what have you, just kind of opening the floor up and asking this question about AGI in the far future, but then within the context of human regulations and within the context of technologies that are aimed at making these systems more trustworthy. Any thoughts whatsoever? So,
do you want to go first or second, Toby? I don't care.
Either way. Yeah. Go ahead, Joan.
Okay, good, because this is what I tried to say at the beginning, and so I'll just try to say it again. We already have completely general intelligence. We have this thing called Bayes' law. We can combine any information for any particular context. We already have superhuman capacities. This house has a superhuman capacity to shelter people. It's not a big deal. We're talking about human culture, and it isn't that we're just gonna, I mean, to some extent, some people think that the right way to think about governments and corporations is that those are artificial intelligence, and they are running away, and nobody understands them. And even if you're talking about super intelligence and you're talking about exponential increases of capacity, that describes humanity since we've had writing. And that's part of, again, the problems we're trying to deal with now. So I don't think there's any long-term stable configuration where there's going to be machines and not people. I think when we get on top of sustainability, we may wind up without digital if it turns out that we can't find good ways to coordinate ourselves. But I don't think we're going to have anything that's recognizably human culture without humans at the core of it. And so I think a lot of this is fantasy.
Toby?
I'd agree with Joanna. In some sense, corporations are super intelligence that we already have. And therefore, and we can already see the thing that, AGI people worry about, value alignment, is something that we already have. We already have a problem that corporations are polluting the world's atmosphere, cause, the prime cause of most of the carbon gases that are causing climate change are emitted due to the actions of 70 corporations. That's it. If we could control those 70 corporations, if we could align their values better with human values, or the rest of humanity's values, then the climate emergency would be over. And we've seen this so many other times. We saw this with tobacco. We saw this, we've seen this with big pharma. We've seen this with telecoms. We've seen that. I mean, we've always seen large business run to excess and have to be suitably regulated, and we're seeing that today. And so, value alignment is a problem. We already have it, and we need to fix that to be able to tackle the biggest existential crisis of today, the climate emergency, and we need it longer term to deal with some of the other wicked problems like increasing inequality within and between our countries. And that is a real challenge, and we still haven't fixed that properly. I mean, we are always slow to act. But I am optimistic that we will eventually get on top of this. I'm not sure how many degrees of temperature we're going to have to increase the planet by before we get to that point, but we will have to solve that problem. And technology, like AI, indeed, are part of the solution, indeed, because 10 years ago, there was an opportunity for political solutions to these problems. We could have acted without making significant technological changes to the way we run the planet. That's no longer possible. It's too late for purely political solutions to those problems. We now actually have to use various technologies to actually change the planet in a better way.
No, I totally disagree. Sorry. So it's not only corporations that are AI, it is also governments. And so I agree with some of that what you were saying before about the value alignment. It's long, but you can't just say, oh, the corporations are the problem and it's not the governments and the NGOs. There's some pretty weird NGOs out there. We all celebrate the Red Cross or whatever, but there's all kinds of human coordinations.
All of
so
these
this
systems
is what
are
humans do with this kind of communication technology. We make these coordinated things and we need to get on top of understanding them. But there will be no solutions that aren't political solutions. And that you cannot do this disaggregation of political solutions, technology, all these things. This is how we coordinate. So don't just demonize the corporations or demonize the governments or say that we have to throw stuff in the air. Like we could get rid of the cows, reforest, and it's still not all sustainability, but it's part of the problem solved.
No, the political system has deeply failed us. All of those institutions have deeply failed us. But it is worth pointing out that corporations are a modern day invention of the Industrial Revolution, and they are no longer particularly fit for purpose. And those have to be reformed, as do the political systems, and so that the politics is more aligned with people's values. And we're seeing the reason people are disillusioned with politics is because politics is not delivering anymore. It is not answering. It is technology is not helping that either. But there are many institutions that need reform. But we won't get there if we allow corporations to continue to run to excess. And we've always had to rein in the excesses of corporations. And you look at the history of antitrust, we've always, when corporations became too big and too powerful, they became monopolistic, and they weren't acting in humankind's best interests. That was true for big oil, now the biggest corporations on the planet are tech companies, and they are starting to have to, we have to start to worry about how we rein in their worst excesses.
There's like an order of magnitude more money in finance than tech, but I mean, half of what you say I agree, and half of it is false dichotomies again. It isn't that politics has failed us. It is the combination of technology, corporations, politics, and all that other thing that got us to the point where we have 8 billion people, which maybe
all of those failings,
we're going to wind up with fewer or something, but we may wind up with a stable solution at about the scale of population.
Yeah, there is more.
So that's what I'm frustrated, because I totally agree with half of what you're saying, and I totally think that you're scapegoating and
so it looks like
there is more money in finance, but the only $1 trillion companies on the planet are tech companies.
I totally agree. That's part of the reason I'm here.
There is a greater concentration of that wealth in tech companies.
That's why I left computer science to go to governance.
Sure, the finance companies have ultimately more money, but
I think we should stop at that note. A very interesting discussion, very wonderful points from Dr. Joanna Bryson and Dr. Toby Walsh. Thank you so much for your excellent points and excellent discussion. Thank you. I'm going to clap for everybody. And I'm also going to make an announcement right now. So to the listeners, again, thank you for joining us today. The event was recorded. It should be available next week on our website if you wish to rewatch it or share it. And the last webinar in this series is next week on November 29th. So please do join Dr. Vespa Momani as she moderates what happens when AI actually fails, who is responsible. So a lot of the theme from today's discussion perhaps carries over to that discussion as well. And the webinar will feature Dr. Alex Wilner from Carleton University and Eleanor Powles from the Global Center on Cooperative Security in New York. And the link of the event has been posted in the chat. So with that, thank you, Toby, thank you, Joanna, and thank you all the participants and attendees for attending this. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.